Good morning. This video will go through Chapter 7 of the English 101 Critical Thinking and Academic Writing curriculum. We will be covering evaluation in this chapter. Questions you should be able to answer after completing this chapter include what are the characteristics of a strong argument? How do you evaluate evidence to determine whether it is relevant, sufficient, or accurate? What's the difference between warranted and unwarranted assumptions? How do you determine the credibility of an author, a source, or an organization? How do you evaluate deductive arguments for validity, truth, and soundness? And finally, what are some common logical fallacies? These are the terms that you should be familiar with once you finish this chapter. So we're going to start with the process of evaluation. Essentially, when you're evaluating an argument or a claim, you want to follow these four steps. The first thing that you have to do is identify the argument. What is the claim? What is the author trying to persuade you of or convince you to do or make you believe? Once you've identified that argument, then you can begin to identify the evidence. What pieces of support is the author using to prove his argument, or what details, what information are they using to try and convince you or persuade you of their argument? So in the last chapter, we talked about evidence being four different types of evidence: facts and statistics, testimonials, hypotheticals, and analogies. So here in step 2, you're identifying which of those types of evidence are they using and how they're using it to support their argument. In the third step, you're going to take those pieces of evidence that you've identified and you're going to evaluate each one. We have to determine whether this piece of evidence is something that we should be paying attention to or not. Is this a strong piece of evidence? Is this convincing or persuasive? Or maybe it isn't. So we'll talk later in this chapter about how you evaluate that evidence. Because once you've evaluated the evidence, then you can come to a final conclusion on the evaluation of the argument itself. Is this an effective argument? Yes, because the evidence was relevant and sufficient and accurate, and because the author was credible. Or perhaps you'll evaluate the argument and find that no, this is not an effective argument. I am not going to believe this because the evidence was not relevant or not sufficient or not accurate, and because the author was not credible. So these are the steps to evaluate an argument, and it's important as critical thinkers that you be able to evaluate arguments wherever they come up. It might be in an article that you're reading in the Wall Street Journal, or it might be something that you're seeing on the news, or it might be in a conversation that you're having with a coworker. So you have to be willing to apply these steps wherever you find someone trying to persuade you or convince you of something. As I mentioned briefly already, the standards of evaluation that we want to evaluate for are relevance, sufficiency, and accuracy. When we are evaluating evidence in an argument, we want to make sure that that evidence is relevant, sufficient, and accurate. If we are finding that the evidence is not these things, then we would consider that to be a weak argument. Whereas if we find that the evidence is relevant, sufficient, and accurate, then we would call that a strong argument. So we're going to talk more about each one of these metrics. In order to evaluate for relevance, the question that you're trying to answer is this evidence really related to the argument? Does it matter? Is it important in determining how I should, think about this argument? So if I were to say that we should paint the walls of the classroom, I'm trying to convince you guys as my students to come in next week and help me paint this classroom. And I was trying to convince you to do that? What if I said that we needed to paint the walls of this classroom because my son really doesn't like the color gray? That is not relevant evidence. It has nothing to do with the actual, issue at hand. It is not related to the argument. It should not be used as a method of convincing you to come paint the classroom with me. So that's what you're looking for when you look for evidence. You want evidence to be related to the argument and for it to be important and significant with relation to the claim. Irrelevant evidence is unimportant, unrelated, and should not be used. That doesn't mean that people won't use irrelevant evidence to support their arguments because they just want to convince you. So they're going to throw everything they can think of at you, and some of it might be irrelevant. It's your job as the audience, as a critical thinker, to say to yourself, wait a minute, this is irrelevant. I should not be using this as a basis for my decision. Sufficiency essentially just means, is it enough evidence? It's important to keep track of whether there's enough data, if it's a large enough sample size. Sometimes people are trying to give you facts and statistics because they know that that's strong evidence, but they may not have a large sample size. So if I were trying to convince you of the importance of school uniforms, and I told you that of 3 schools that were surveyed, they found that there was an increase in student success related to school uniforms. Would that be enough data to support making a statewide mandate for school uniforms? I don't know if you remember, I said there were 3 schools that were surveyed. I would argue that that is a not large enough sample in order to make that decision. So that would be an example of evidence that is not sufficient. If I were going to make a statewide mandate about school uniforms, I would certainly want information from more than 3 schools, right? What if I said there were 12 students who agreed that school uniforms were instrumental in their success? Again, 12 students is not sufficient. That is not a large enough sample size to make a decision. So you do have to ask yourself whether or not there's enough evidence, or whether or not the statistics or the data that's being shared comes from a large enough sample. And finally, we need to evaluate for accuracy. We don't always know. We kind of tend to assume that the information we're given is accurate, but we really need to be better critical thinkers than that. We need to find out whether or not this information is credible based on other information that's out there. We're asking ourselves, can we find corroboration for this evidence through other sources? Do we know that this is accurate, or does this seem like it might be off? Sometimes you kind of have a sense of whether these numbers are accurate or not, and then that gives you enough information to go sort of dig deeper and look for more evidence to find out whether or not it's accurate. So believability in the box at the bottom is kind of the idea that whether the results seem reasonable. It's a fine line because we don't, we probably are not going to fact check every single thing that we come across, even though that's probably the best way to make sure that information is accurate. So we have to kind of balance between what information can I take at face value and what information needs to be investigated more. So you kind of have to sort of hone your own ability to decide whether or not information is believable and decide what information you really need to check for accuracy and what you don't. I will tell you that for the critical analysis assignment that you're going to be doing, you definitely should just check for accuracy. That's going to be part of your evaluation. Another thing that you want to keep in mind when you're evaluating evidence is whether or not the information is a fact or whether it's opinion. So we've talked about fact and opinion in the past, the idea that facts can be proven, whereas opinions are just individual people's perspectives or experiences. And we've said that facts typically are stronger pieces of evidence than opinions. But it's important to determine that there's kind of a middle ground between fact and opinion that we haven't talked about before. And that's this idea of reasoned judgment or expert opinion, which is still an opinion, it's still a testimonial, but it carries a little bit more weight than your average testimonial because the opinion comes from someone who has a great deal of education or experience in a particular field, which makes them an expert, which is why we call it an expert opinion. So expert opinions are still testimonials, but we typically count them as more credible or effective or stronger evidence than, just interviewing a random person on the street about how they feel. Whereas you're going to get kind of a weaker piece of evidence from that testimonial. So when you're evaluating an argument and you're finding that there are testimonials being used as evidence, you have to ask yourself whether this is an opinion, a testimonial, or is this an expert opinion? And should you grant it a little bit more credence? Evaluating credibility is a really important part of evaluating evidence. You have to ask yourself about the credibility of the author, the source, and the organization, the larger organization that's responsible for the information being presented. So the author may or may not have education or experience that makes him or her an expert. In Amy Chua's Why Chinese Mothers Are Superior, she is a professor at, I think, Yale. She's a psychologist. She studies like development. So that would make her an expert to some degree in the field of child rearing. So you would be able to say that she is a credible author. You also want to look at their reputation. What else have they published? Are they widely respected within their field? What's their purpose? Are they writing for the purpose of informing their audience, or are they blatantly trying to persuade or sell a product? And do you think that the author is using biased language? Are they providing you both sides of the story and letting you choose for yourself? Or are they being very one-sided in their presentation of the facts? So those are all questions that you want to ask about author credibility. Source credibility is similar in that you are asking how credible or believable is information coming from this source. Now the source is going to be maybe the publication, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the National Enquirer or some lady's homemaking blog, right? That's the source. So you want to ask yourself, first of all, is this current? Is this current information? Who reviewed this to make sure that it's accurate? With the Wall Street Journal, they probably have a pretty strict review process before they allow people to publish information, whereas the homemaking blog, that lady probably didn't have anybody vet her information before she put it online. So who published this? Was this published in another source? Was this a research study that was published by a journal somewhere? Typically, if you're evaluating print sources, you can verify a little bit more easily that the information was reviewed. Online sources are trickier because it's very easy for people to put anything they want up on the internet. So with blogs, we kind of know that that's just a personal opinion, but you can also easily go out and purchase a .org domain name, create your own website, and put whatever you want on it. That doesn't make it credible. So you have to just be careful with online sources and do a little bit more digging to determine credibility. With organizational credibility, this is with, if you have an author or a publication that is tied to